how it all got started, and so that's been a hobby of mine, and we're all equally ignorant as far as I can see. That's why somebody like me can pretend to be an expert. And anyhow, I was struck by the fact that the picture of early life that appeared in Carl Wose's article that was, I guess, 3 years ago, in which he had this picture of early life as a pre-Darwinian epoch where genetic information was open source and everything was shared between different organisms. And that picture actually fits very nicely together with my speculative version of origin of life. So I might just talk about that a little bit. And so you have, according to this idea, you separate metabolism from replication. That's the essential idea. We know modern life has both metabolism and replication, but they're carried out by completely separate groups of molecules. The metabolism carried out by proteins and all kinds of other small molecules, and then replication carried out by DNA and RNA. And there seems that maybe is a clue to the fact that they really did start out separate rather than together. So my version of the origin of life is it started with metabolism only. So you had what I call the garbage bag model, which is that the early cells were just little bags of some kind of cell membrane, which might have been oily or it might have been a metal oxide or various things it could have been. And inside you had a more or less random collection of organic molecules with the characteristic that the small molecules could diffuse in through the membrane, but big molecules could not diffuse out. So by converting small molecules into big molecules, you could concentrate the organic contents in the inside. So the cells would become more concentrated, and therefore the chemistry would become gradually more efficient. So these things could evolve without any kind of replication. Simply, it's a simple statistical inheritance where when a cell became so big that it got cut in half or shaken in half by some rainstorm or environmental disturbance, that it would then produce two cells which would be its daughters, which would inherit more or less, but only statistically, the chemical machinery inside. But evolution could work under those conditions.
Freeman, do you envisage these are naturally occurring lipid membranes, or what
yes.
you're thinking of these as? Okay.
So they don't have to be lipids, but anyway,
yeah, sure.
It could be
naturally occurring membranes.
Yes, which we do know exist.
Right, exactly.
Anyhow, so that's stage one of life, is this garbage bag stage where there's evolution is happening, but only on a statistical basis. And of course, I think it's right to call it pre-Darwinian, because Darwinian only talked about, Darwin himself did not use the word evolution. He was primarily interested in species, not in evolution as such. Well, then what happened next? Then stage two is then when you have parasitic RNA, when RNA happens to occur in some of these cells, and there's a linkage perhaps between metabolism and replication in the molecule ATP. We know ATP has a dual function. It is very important for metabolism, but it also is essentially a nucleotide. You have to add only two phosphates and it becomes a nucleotide. So it gives you a link between the two systems. So perhaps one of these garbage bags happened to develop ATP by a random process. ATP is very helpful to the metabolism, so these cells then multiplied and became very numerous and made large quantities of ATP. And then, by chance, then this ATP formed an adenine nucleotide, which then polymerized into RNA. So you had then parasitic RNA inside these cells forming a separate form of life, which was purely replication without metabolism. So the RNA could replicate itself. It couldn't metabolize, but it could do quite nicely. Well, then the RNA then invented viruses. The RNA found a way to package itself in a little piece of cell membrane and travel around freely and independently. So then stage 2 of life has then the garbage bag still unorganized and essentially chemically random, but RNA zooming around in little packages which we call viruses, carrying the genetic information from one cell to another. And that is what we might call the RNA world. It sort of corresponds to what Manfred Eichen considered to be the beginning of life, which I regard as stage 2. And that you have RNA living independently, replicating, traveling around, so sharing genetic information between cells and between all kinds of cells. Well, then stage 3, which is the most mysterious, I would say, is how these two systems actually started to collaborate. And so it's essentially the invention of the ribosome, which to me is sort of the central mystery, and I think there's a tremendous lot of archaeology that ought to be done with investigating the archaeology of the ribosome. I hope some of you people will do it. Anyhow, so once the ribosome is invented, then the two systems, the RNA world and the metabolic world, then are coupled together, and you get then modern cells. So that's stage 3, but still with the genetic information being shared mostly by viruses traveling from cell to cell. So it is an open source heredity. So evolution could be very fast, as Carl Woese described it. That's roughly the situation that, as Carl Woese described it. You have modern type of cells with metabolism directed by RNA or DNA, but without any private intellectual property, so that the chemical inventions made by one cell could be shared with others. So evolution could go in parallel in many different cells, so it could go a hell of a lot faster. And then the best chemical devices then could be shared between different cells and combined, so evolution would go rapidly in parallel. And that was probably the fastest stage of chemical evolution, when most of the basic biochemical inventions were made. Then stage 4 is the stage of speciation and sex, which are the next two big inventions. So that's the beginning of the Darwinian era, when species appeared. So some cells decided it was advantageous to keep their intellectual property private, to have sex only with themselves or with the members of their own species, thereby defining species. So that was then the state of life for the next 2 billion years, the Archaeozoic and Proterozoic eras, when it was a rather stagnant phase. Life continued for 2 billion years without evolving fast. Then you had the stage 5, which was the invention of multicellular organisms, and which also involved death, which was also an important invention. And then after that there came us, the stage 6, when
I like the fact that sex was invented before death.
Right.
That seems very kind.
I think that's a historical fact.